being with us today. I want to start off this sermon by telling you all a little something about myself, something that is deeply true of me as a maker, listener, and lover of music. I'm a huge liner notes nerd. I grew up in the CD era, just barely catching the tail end of cassettes. Enough so that I do remember buying Bad Hair Day by Weird Al Yankovic at a Blockbuster Music in a strip mall. And if that sentence doesn't send you back in time, I don't know what will. But with both cassette and CD, I would spend the afternoons of my teenage years lying on my back in my bedroom, listening to albums front to back, and reading these tiny typed liner notes in my hand, learning the secrets of who made what sound and how in the breakup song that's bringing tears to my eyes, even though I haven't started dating yet. And this was pre-internet, mind you. So the images that I had available of the musicians who were rocking my world was pretty much limited to what was in the album art. Sure, like sometimes a band would do a photo shoot for a magazine, but it was more so for the pop stars on MTV than the kind of dorky piano bands that I was really into. Now, part of this fascination was just, as an aspiring music maker, how do these amazing things get made? Why does Nirvana's Nevermind sound so good? The media, the story and the pictures insist that it's these three guys. Or if we're being honest, plenty of people thought it was just Kurt. But the liner notes told me a different story. When I looked at the pictures, I was told that great music is made by singular figures of greatness, these towering stars. But when I looked at the liner notes, they told me that it took a whole village of engineers, mixers, a random cymbal guy, a cellist, a background singer who swung by the studio, buried deep in the mix, giving it that certain something. Now, I carried this sort of bifurcated view of the music industry, the work we celebrate versus the work we conceal, for a long time. Who gets the credit? Who gets the glory? And who's doing the work? But it wasn't until I started working with pop producers in New York that I learned that the efforts to reduce group work to individual genius are often very intentional on behalf of the industry. We hide writers of pop songs, players of drums and bass and all the stanky instruments that let us dance, and on purpose create narratives that deposit all creative responsibility and credit in the hands of the top-billed person. Why? Because people want it. It's a monument to the glory of individual greatness, and it sells because we crave it. Now, it's that very deep-seated, very human desire to witness and participate in individual greatness that I want us to hold as a lens through which to view this particular gospel scene. Jesus has just told his disciples of the inevitability of his death. They're on the road to Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus tells them he will be seized and murdered by the authorities. When we hear James and John making this request of Jesus to sit at his right and left hand, remember that it's coming in a moment of fear in anticipation of loss. I did see one or two people look up when David said it starts at verse 32, because that's not what I printed in the bulletin, and that's my mistake. But it's because when you start at 32 and you just start with them making this request, they kind of sound like jerks. They're like, hey, can you do whatever we ask? That's a weird thing to say out of nowhere, but it's not coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of the fear of losing their friend and their teacher. Jesus has just told them what to come, and so when he asks if they will drink from the same cup, it's not some cryptic reference. They were just talking about it. And James and John weren't just a couple of nobodies either. Besides Peter, they're the only other disciples regularly mentioned by name at all the important events in the Gospel of Mark. They're the third and the fourth disciples whom Jesus calls right after Simon Peter and his brother Andrew. And did you know they're also the only other disciples besides Peter to receive nicknames from Jesus? For the record, I always wanted to be a nickname kid at summer camp. All the cool kids were getting named Turbo or whatever, and I just never got one. So this stands out to me. But James and John, in the same conversation where Jesus gives Peter the nickname the Rock, he also gives them one of the coolest tandem nicknames I've ever heard: Sons of Thunder. Cool. I would love to see their liner notes. But according to Mark, these sons of thunder, yeah, they were right there with Peter and Jesus for all the tough stuff: resurrecting the official's daughter at Capernaum, the transfiguration on the mountaintop, praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in fact, just last week, we heard the story of them admonishing people who drove out demons in the name of someone other than Jesus. And then Jesus turned around and admonished them himself. But the point is, they are present, they are inner circle. And when I hold all of that in my hand, their request doesn't seem quite so ludicrous or selfish. In fact, I start to see inklings of courage and bravery in there. They're willing to do the work. And yet, Jesus says no to the promise of glory, no to the right and left-hand seats. He says, you can do the work, but it's not up to me who sits here, who receives the glory, the attention, the credit. And then the other disciples get mad, angry. Interesting how one or two persons' aspirations to individual greatness can turn a whole group in on itself. I wonder what kind of things they grumbled. Did they accuse them of being gauche, tacky, self-centered? Or did they too secretly desire a portion of the glory? The text doesn't give us these answers, but what it does give us is Jesus' answer. An answer he gives in response to seeing that infighting among his disciples. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. The Gentiles, an outside group, but not just a specific group, but really a broad term for the variegated peoples conquered by and assimilated into the Roman Empire. And remember that one of the central tensions for ancient Jews in an occupied Jerusalem was this question of assimilation. Should we blend in and enjoy greater security, or should we refuse to assimilate and risk retaliation? So when Jesus brings up Gentiles, basically everybody else, know that the differentiation is danger here. And yet, despite the risk, Jesus levies this criticism that I think is much more cutting and incisive than it first seems. Hear this phrase, those whom they recognize as their rulers. Do you hear that complicity, that participation kind of being called out in between the lines there? The active verb is recognize, which puts a certain onus on the ruled. In that tiny little turn of phrase, Jesus implies that the Gentiles are, at least to an extent, choosing this. And what is it that they choose? For someone to lord their power over them, to equivocate greatness with tyrannical impulses. It's a form of power, a shape of power, an ancient thread that runs through all the scriptures. A former professor of mine referred to it like this: there is power, and there's power over. There is power in love, in truth, in sacrifice, and there is power in putting someone else down. The power of cooperation versus the power of conflict. In this great story we tell of a non-coercive God accompanying and guiding us through the ages, one of the central challenges has always been how to interpret the holy power of God without confusing it with the human invention of power over. But it is not so among you, Jesus continues. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. How's that for power dynamics? How's that for hierarchy, right? In a way that is just so human, so understanding, Jesus seems to acknowledge that seeking greatness is built into many of our hearts. Some of us want it for ourselves. Some of us just want to see it, to be near it. And that's as true for the Gentiles as it is for the disciples, as it is for the American electorate, as it is for anyone who wants to pretend like Nirvana was a Kurt Cobain project instead of a band collaboration. But instead of quashing the impulse to greatness, Jesus redefines what greatness is. He's saying, look, out there they have this one idea of what makes someone great. It's not like that in here for us. They're choosing that model, and we're building a different one. And what I especially love about that is that this isn't just a moral critique, it's the proposal of a system, right? Because every time you serve someone, you voluntarily relinquish your power, such that the pursuit of greatness is in the same instance a rejection of the other kind. It is circular. It is peculiar on purpose. It is stable and sustainable, not because of one great leader keeping everything in place, but because of the constant motion of whoever's on top moving themselves to the bottom through love and service. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. For us Christians, this must be the definition of greatness. If we sign ourselves up to be ruled by tyrants, even if those tyrants aren't one of us, even if we don't want the glory for ourselves, but instead want to gaze upon the magnificent monument, we betray this fundamental aspect of Jesus' call. And that's not just sad because we ignore our friend and teacher. Jesus doesn't demand obedience for obedience's sake, but because he is showing us a path to our greatest flourishing. And the rigidity of tyrannical rule just doesn't allow for the vast multitude of human experience and expression that God crafted in each of us, in the totality of us. Tyranny demands a homogeneity, a sameness in culture that is a direct denial of the holy diversity baked into creation and affirmed throughout the Bible. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. Some say the shift happened way back when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, suddenly rocketing it from radical splinter group to state religion. Some say that American Protestantism is on its own particular journey these last few hundred years, accruing the dark baggage of colonialism, manifest destiny, and slavery, while also riding high on what a theoretically representative democracy can accomplish. Right? Unlike Jesus and the 12, we actually do have political power. We can vote and shape our society. And indeed, while we've still got a long way to go in terms of how we distribute it, we really have generated a massive amount of prosperity. And yet, this temptation to chase a certain kind of tyrannical glory rises and recedes through the decades, but it never really goes away for good, does it? Just this once, just this one time, we tell ourselves. We'll use that power to set things right. And then we'll put it away for good. In each age, we confront ourselves again. In a few weeks, we will find out what the American people have chosen this time. And if you're scared, stressed, distracted, or fidgety, me too. And I know that many of us here have very strong feelings about what outcome we want for our country. That's not wrong. Me too. But as we continue to get out the vote, have these conversations, advocate for our candidate of choice, I want to say something explicitly, perhaps bluntly. The broad traditions of American Protestantism don't often prepare us for outcomes other than victory. Outcomes other than triumph. Sometimes we get so caught up in the theology of an assured victory that we get blindsided into despair when or if that victory doesn't materialize, and it's easy to feel alone in that despair. Hear me when I say, you are not alone. We're still here as a church, as disciples, And in fact, in a month, we're gathering to have our own internal vote on denominational affiliation, our own democratic process of consensus building and trusting. And sure, we bicker about who sits where, who deserves credit, when, and why, and probably some of us wish we had a super cool nickname too, but that's as old as our tradition itself. But if you are feeling that creep of election despair, remember that the inaugurators of the way did so from a position of zero political power. The power that the rest of the world recognized as great did not rest in the hands of either Jesus or the 12. I'm sure they had feelings about who was emperor. But what did Jesus do with the disciples? He brought them back to a place of service. Look for who needs help and go to them. There will always be people who need help, regardless of who sits atop the throne, regardless of who claims to be great. Let us go to them. After all, didn't dear Mr. Rogers tell us something about helpers? When I was a boy, he said, and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And so when the scared, the vulnerable of the world look up from the news, may you, may I, may we all be found among the helpers.